In this video, I really want to talk about the wind, because the wind is something that if you don't fully understand how it positions bass, you are leaving some fish out there. You are leaving some fish on the table to be caught. And the thing about it is the wind almost impacts every single day that we are out there fishing, whether there is a lack of wind or whether you have a lot of wind. So in this video, I really want to talk about three big things that is something that I always look out for when it comes to the wind in fishing. Now, before we get into it, this video is brought to you by Fin Fishing Apparel. Right now, over at Fin Fishing, everything is 20% off, including the USA made sun shirts, one of the only sun shirts made in the US. And right now they're like $43, which is cheaper than most brands sell their ones that are made overseas. Now, I'm not completely against things that are made overseas. I have things that are made overseas over at Fin Fishing as well. There's some manufacturing that just doesn't take place here in the US. But anyways, also I am running a huge contest from now until the end of the year. For every dollar that is spent over at Fin Fishing, you will get an entry into a contest where I'm giving away 10 big prizes. Now, I don't have all the prizes squared away. I do have 4 of them squared away, which include a brand new $150 arc reel, a 6 cents draw $50 glide bait, a $2,000 Solix Humminbird Solix 12, and I'm also giving away a fishing trip with myself. Basically, I'm going to come to your home lake and do a lake break video on it, something that I've never done before, but is going to be kind of cool. But anyways, links are down below in the description. Check out Fin Fishing today. All right, let's talk a little bit about the wind. And like I said, the thing about wind is it truly impacts every day that we go fishing. And sometimes it impacts it in minor ways. Sometimes it obviously impacts it in really major ways. Sometimes when we go out there, a lack of the wind can really change up a few things. And I'm going to give you one big thing. I actually just thought of a fourth thing that is really important. So I'm going to start with number 4 before it leaves my mind. But one of the biggest things that the wind is going to impact is simply your bait selection. That is one of the biggest things, because if you have a lot of wind, you tend to have fish that are a little bit more aggressive. They are a little bit easier to be caught on fast moving or more aggressive baits. And sometimes when you have a lack of wind, you really have to finesse fish. And sometimes that can mean huge changes between things like a spinnerbait and a Texas rig. Sometimes it can mean very minor changes. For example, this past fall, I was fishing a day and I had found some fish for a tournament and I was catching them on a larger, like minnow style bait, and they seemed to be very aggressive on that. Well, tournament day came around, dead slack calm. And those fish would follow that minnow all the way to the boat, would not eat it. I switched over to a 3-inch, something very, very small, same exact bait realm, and those fish absolutely started choking it. So the biggest thing that wind can impact right off the get-go is your lure selection. Now let's talk about the 3 things that I actually wanted to talk about in this video, which the first thing is actually going to be surface temperature. This is something that in the fall and really in the springtime can be absolutely huge. A lot of times we think as anglers, and we'll talk about this a little bit, that the wind, you catch more fish on windy banks because of their aggressive nature, kind of like what we just talked about. But one of the biggest things, especially in the springtime, that the wind does is it's going to push that surface water. And when you have lakes that are trying to warm up in the springtime, if it pushes all that surface temperature, which is typically quite a bit warmer than the water that's directly below it, you are going to create pockets of water that are very warm in certain areas where that wind is pushing into. And that makes a huge difference. You know, I got to fish with a professional angler this year earlier, and that was the whole deal to his success out there on the water. Anywhere where you would have a little bit of a pocket and the wind was pushing into it, that water temp would be 3 or 4 degrees warmer than the rest of the lake. And therefore, the fish that were in that zone were a lot more aggressive and you were able to catch them. It wasn't that you couldn't catch fish elsewhere, it's just that those fish were biting lures that were a little bit faster paced, and there was just more fish in that general zone. You saw more life as well. So that's actually talk about the second thing that I really want to talk about, which is kind of what I just alluded to, is that the other thing that wind does, probably the biggest thing, you'll hear guys talk about it pushing bait fish. The wind doesn't necessarily push bait fish, but again, it positions bait fish, which positions the bass. The big thing about the wind, as a lot of us know, is that it pushes plankton, whether that is, like zooplankton, for example. And zooplankton is what those little tiny shad and those little tiny bait fish are going to feed on. Even little tiny bass will feed on those. And so those bait fish are a lot of times are going to go to those areas where that zooplankton has been pushed to, because the zooplankton can't keep up with the wind. So it is going to get pushed into certain areas. The bait fish are going to follow, the bass are going to follow it. That's simple food chain fishing. Like, that's what it is. And I have seen so many days, not just in the springtime, where simply getting on a windy bank means that you start to get around a lot of fish. Or what you tend to find sometimes is you tend to find a pattern that bass are on, and the wind just escalates it. For example, I remember getting on this pattern. This was a number of years ago. It was in like that post-spawn time of the year, and the fish were kind of coming out of the creeks, and a lot of these fish were on the last point, like the last secondary point that was in the main creek before it got to the main lake. And I could catch fish on almost every secondary point that was in that position on the lake, but the ones that had the wind on them, you would catch way more fish. And I think it was simply because, again, there seemed to be more life in those zones. Again, more plankton, more bait fish, more bass. So always think about the wind when you're out there, how it is pushing that plankton around. Now let's talk about the third thing, and this is so very important, and there's a number of ways to dissect this, but the wind is one of the biggest things that is going to generate current on our bodies of water. And anytime you have current in a system, it is going to position fish in certain ways. And there's so many different ways to think about it. There's so many different ways that the wind can push fish in and out of areas. All that all revolves around the current. And a couple of big things that I always have seen is that on lakes where you don't see a lot of current generated, there's some lakes, that are on these big rivers like the Tennessee River where they generate current. Those fish get really fixated on the current. And sometimes when the wind is going against the current, it can really mess things up. But on lakes where you don't necessarily have that, the wind is the biggest force that makes current on this lakes. And you will see anywhere, there's a couple things that I look for. When fish are on structure, even though it may be 15 foot deep, there will be a little bit of a current that starts to create if the wind pushes in the same direction over the course of a day. And it's going to position fish on that offshore structure in a big way. And a lot of times what you will see is that the front edge of these topographical features, whatever it may be, these structures, maybe it's a point, maybe it's a hump, that is where a lot of times a lot of aggressive fish will be. Let me use this as an example. If you have current that is pushing up against a hump, this little deal is a hump. A lot of times as it pushes up against a hump, it's going to roll up and over the hump. If you've ever seen like a car in a wind tunnel, you'll see this. Well, some structural features are like this one. It's a ledge. And if the wind hits up against this, pushes over it, what happens is you create a little bit of an eddy right here, a little bit of a zone where the bass do not have to be in the current. They can position themselves where they do not have to swim that much because they're in this little bit of an eddy right here. And so a lot of times those fish, the active ones, will be sitting right there on the lip, on the edge, ready for your bait. Now, with that being said, you have to think about how the fish is going to best bite your baits. What I mean by that is that sometimes casting from deep to shallow and hitting those fish can work. Sometimes though, it's actually better to go shallow, cast deep, and bring your bait up because that's a little bit more natural to the fish. And so that's a big thing that wind is going to do when it comes to a structural feature under the water. Another huge thing when it comes to the wind and current is pinch points become escalated. And we talk about pinch points, I feel like, all the time because I feel like it is the most obvious structure on a lake that the majority of anglers don't pay attention to, if that makes sense. There's a lot of guys who understand this, but a lot of guys don't seek it. That's the big thing. there's a lot of things in bass fishing that we know, but we're not intentional about. And a pinch point is one of those. We have seen years and years and years of Bassmaster tournaments on Lake Guntersville where bridges dominate. And the reason that those bridges dominate is because they create a pinch point. They always go there during the pre-spawn or the post-spawn where fish are going into creeks or fish are coming out of creeks, and it creates a pinch point in those zones where the fish have to pass through it. Well, no matter what lake that you have, no matter, it doesn't have to be a bridge. It could be any other structural feature. A lot of times it is bridge, but sometimes it's just two areas that are really close together. A lot of times if you have wind, that water that is flowing has to narrow down. So it actually starts to move faster through that area. And when you have a lot of current going through an area, it is just a place where I'm telling you that current, bass just seek it. They look for it. They're going to be there. They're going to be in those eddies a lot of times on the sides of those pinch points, and they're going to be ready for bait fish that come through that area, come through that zone. And so I always look for pinch points. The other thing is that on super mega big bodies of water like this, I've seen it a little bit more up in the northern part of the country, you know, because like, for example, on Lake Erie, if you have wind going across Lake Erie from one direction to the other, it can literally drop the lake 3-4 foot on one side. It may not be that huge on other lakes, but it still may draw the water down a little bit on your bodies of water or push a lot of water into your area. So again, the wind can impact the shallow water fishing in that zone. If you get on a really good shallow water bite, but the fish have just enough water to be over their head, and then all of a sudden you have a huge wind, it draws the water out of there. Those fish, they may not necessarily leave the area, but they may just kind of go to areas where they have just a little bit more depth. It may be the deepest water that is close by. And so it can impact that whole zone. And the other thing is that a lot of times as the wind pushes water out, eventually it has to come back in. Anywhere it comes back in, again, any of those pinch points, there's going to be more current, and those are going to be prime little areas for you to catch fish. I know there's a lake by me that it's not a big lake. It's a 3,600 acre lake. And I was talking to this saw guy fisherman a number of years ago. And on this lake, we have what are called tubes. They're basically culverts that go under the bridge, and they are literally about, I don't know, 8 foot wide. It's like barely big enough to get a decent sized bass boat in. And they're only about 3-4 foot deep at max. And I heard this old time saw guy fisherman said that he would always wait for an east wind on this particular body of water, or an east wind, because the way that this one culvert positions, it is dead on the west side of this lake. And when the east wind pushes water up into that culvert on the lake, as it draws out that night, he said when that water would draw out that night, it creates a lot of current coming through that small culvert. And the saw guy of all things would position right there, ready for bait fish. It's the same concept, but it's just in a micro scale. And it's not only bass that I'm talking about here, but it's obviously saw guy. So when it comes to wind, there is a number of huge factors that you need to consider. And so I hope that this helps explain how the wind can be your best friend, also your worst enemy. I fished in some 6-footers out there on Lake Erie with the wind. Not fun, but you got to do what you got to do. All right, guys. Hope you enjoyed this video. See you in the next one. I don't know why I'm doing that.